Hello and welcome to the briefing room. I'm Meg Argyriou and I'm the Head of International at Climateworks Centre. Today we will be looking at financing the energy transition, including priorities for Southeast Asia and the role that countries such as Australia can take in speeding up the transition. But first, let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which many of us are dialing in today. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the lands and waters of the people of the Kulin Nation, from which I'm calling in today and on which Climateworks Centre's head office is located. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from where you were joining today, both within and beyond Australia, and pay respect to the solidarity of all Indigenous peoples around the world. And please feel free to use the chat function in Zoom to tell us where you're dialing in from today. Over the next hour, you will hear from three of my excellent colleagues who I have the privilege of working with almost every single day. First up is Dr. Emi Gui, who leads Climateworks Energy System. Second, you'll hear from Guntur Sutiyono, who leads Climateworks Jakarta-based Indonesia team. And then finally, you'll hear from Malos, who is our Australian country lead. So today it's just 12 days until COP27, the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the COP and its processes. And I'll be travelling to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for the conference, along with around 30,000 delegates from across the globe. If you're going to be there, please feel free to reach out and let me know. And climate finance, of course, for those of you who are following the COP, you'll know that this is one of the key target areas that have been identified by the COP27 Egyptian presidency. And this is quite rightly so, given the ongoing need to firm up climate finance from the developed world to the developing world, as well as the increasing intensity and frequency of climate-related events which disproportionately affect developing countries and are in need of financial support. And meanwhile, as you will also be very familiar with, geopolitical uncertainties are affecting energy supply, the energy supply chain. And this, of course, is pushing fuel and commodity prices higher. And we're seeing this especially for fossil fuels. And in addition to this, the US dollar is strengthening, and this is pushing up production costs for clean energy projects. And this in turn is reducing their financial viability. In developing Asia, the energy transition is urgent on many, many levels. It's the region with the fastest growth in greenhouse gas emissions. And this, of course, is driven by growing demand for energy as a result of industrialization and rising incomes. Southeast Asia is actually on track now to become a net importer of fossil fuels. And this, of course, increases its exposure, the region's exposure to volatile energy commodity prices, and that in turn undermines economic growth and in particular, the region's ability to recover from COVID. But there is good news as well, and we're going to get to some of it during the next hour. And we will also have time at the end to answer your questions. So please use the Q&A section on your screen to send those through. So let's kick off with our first speaker, Dr. Emi Gui. And Emi leads Climateworks initiatives and programs in all things energy related. This includes energy system decarbonisation, electricity sector transitions, and net zero planning. And prior to joining Climateworks, Emi worked for 15 years in energy consulting and research. She's also a member of the newly established Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, which is an independent advisory council to the UN Secretary General. I'm going to hand over to you now, Emi.
Thanks for setting the context, Meg. As Meg mentioned, there have been a number of uncertainties around energy investment decision-making in Southeast Asia, perhaps more widely for developing economies in general as well. For example, geopolitical uncertainty affecting energy supply chain, rising US dollars and rising cost of capital, climate change impacts on physical assets and infrastructure, rate of change and uptake of technologies, as well as consumer behavior with respect to new technologies. This impacts overall demand for energy. So these variables inevitably will influence government decision-making and trigger the re-evaluation of which technologies are likely to be prioritized, the pace and the timing of fossil fuel generation phased out, and how to balance energy security, affordability, and sustainability to best suit national objectives and sustainable development goals. Next, I'll quickly review some of the ASEAN-specific challenges for clean energy transition. As highlighted by ASEAN stakeholders we interviewed and surveyed last year. So economic barriers are considered as most urgent to be addressed. This includes high costs of renewable energy, fossil fuel subsidies and protectionism, lack of viable business models and financial incentives for renewable energy and energy efficiency investment. There are also technical and technology challenges. These are concentrated in a number of areas, particularly weak grid infrastructure and the limitation in grid capacity, development of energy efficiency and demand side technologies and approaches, and insufficient local supply chain for renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. So the technical challenges directly affect the availability and accessibility of clean energy products and clean energy supply, while economic challenges highlighted really directly impact the investment cash flow and the financial flow into clean energy projects and increase investment risks for the private and international investors. This will also reduce project bankability, therefore disincentivizing the private sector investment. And not surprisingly, grid readiness and financing are recurring themes highlighted by ASEAN policymakers, recognized as key constraints in developing renewable energy projects, particularly wind and solar. So in this context, I'll discuss some strategies to enable more efficient use of public finance and private finance based on their characteristics in order to de-risk and enhance project bankability. I'll start by exploring some of the key risks around private investment decision-making. Systematic risks include sovereign risks or country risks and policy and regulatory risks. These have limited risk transfer opportunities and are very difficult to mitigate. So sovereign and country risk related to country credit rating, linking to a country's political environment, economic status, and its credit worthiness. More broadly, it can also relate to the overall maturity of countries' financial market, the level of awareness, understanding, and attention towards renewable energy, energy efficiency financing, and risk management instruments. Policy and regulatory risks associated with inadequate enabling regulatory frameworks or policy uncertainties around renewable energy and energy efficiency targets, feed-in tariffs, power purchasing agreements, as well as carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidies. or even the change of country priorities. For example, the re-emergence of energy security as top national priority around the globe due to recent geopolitical events, and how these factors will impact policymakers' preference in terms of technology choice and energy transition strategies. Policy and regulatory risks are among most important risk indicators, particularly for solar and wind energy projects. So in this case, to closely engage with policymakers to provide advisory services on policies, regulations, financial market reforms, supportive of clean energy and infrastructure financing will be a win-win strategy for both investors and policymakers. Of course, geographic diversification across various countries will help to reduce these systematic risks. For example, increasing connectivity across countries and regions through ASEAN Supergrid, via imports from neighboring countries, including Australia, for example, the Sun Cable project. These systematic risks can be significantly reduced when transferring project risk from countries with high systematic risks to countries with low risks. Of course, the insurance products can also be another important tool, although for Southeast Asia, the insurance market is yet to be well developed. I'll move on to physical risks. These refer to construction and operational risks due to weather and climate change, extreme weather events that can damage the assets and infrastructure. Physical risks present in all categories of assets, but particularly more severe for large-scale assets of long development and construction cycle. Some mitigation strategies, including at the beginning, integrate climate change and disaster risk data into the design. This would help to increase infrastructure resilience and prolong the asset life. Or consider more localized energy systems and infrastructure. This will also help to limit physical risks within a specific area, minimizing the system-wide risks. There are also market and sales risks related to variability of revenue due to resource risk, price risk, and volumetric risk from both supply and demand side. This can be mitigated through policy arrangement when offtake is guaranteed by utilities and governments, including feed-in tariffs, other strategies, including geographic diversification. Insurance can also cover some of the sales risks. So in comparison, smaller scale renewable energy projects at residential, commercial, industrial scale can mitigate risk through self-consumption, perhaps self-financing or community financing as well. Energy efficiency financing has been one of the difficult aspect in many cases because the energy efficiency often do not meet the standard investment criteria, such as collateral requirements. So the evaluation of technology and performance is not straightforward or that well benchmarked, and a large number of small size projects also present huge transaction costs for banks. So government incentives can help to overcome some of these barriers. Other strategies also involve engaging through an aggregator or service companies that can act as the intermediary between banks and user groups to help mitigate these risks. Of course, grid risk and curtailment risks are very important as well. I want to quickly mention about large long-term strategic assets. For example, electricity grid, pumped hydro storage, nuclear energy, CCUS. This could be better supported by some level of public finance. So an important aspect is the bankability of these large strategic assets should consider social, economic, and social environmental metrics. For example, improvements in the resilience of communities, alignment with the national priorities and sustainable development goals. Typically, these socioeconomic dimensions will not be reflected in the private sector decision-making, causing disagreement between policy-making and the investment decision-making, as well as discrepancy between intended policy outcomes and investment outcomes. So a number of strategies can help to mitigate this. The role of development banks and the multilateral financial institution could help to include the socioeconomic objectives as eligibility criteria for project lending and private sector lending. Green taxonomy, sustainability standards play an important role in helping to scale up sustainable investment. Green and sustainability linked finance, green bonds, green loans are all designed to embed social and environmental objectives and goals into the provision of finance. Another option, of course, is to form the ownership structure to maximize investment incentives and return. Some national ownership can support the sustainability of these projects and initiatives beyond the lifetime of donor funding. It also plays a key role in reducing the perceived risk of investment to potential financiers, making projects more attractive to private and international investors. Similarly, national ownership and leadership is also required in developing long-term strategic initiatives. For example, coal power plant phase out, research and development, and the technology supply chain. So overall, there has been a realization that all technology solutions are likely to play a part in achieving the low carbon energy transition and net zero goals in the region. This will also include carbon capture, utilization, storage, green hydrogen, power fuels. These technologies, however, rely on energy-intensive processes and require more clean energy capacity to make them work. So the decarbonization question ultimately comes down to how fast we can develop clean energy and energy efficiency capacity. Lastly, these challenges are being faced by a majority of the ASEAN countries. There is a need for Southeast Asian countries to pool resources and bring powers together and address this at the regional level. This will help to achieve economies of scale, accelerate the learning curve and energy transition, and benefit the region as a whole. I'll stop it here and thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Emi. I think that was really useful context on the energy transition, and in particular, some of the approaches that can be taken to improve project bankability in Southeast Asia. I'm going to bring our second speaker in now, Guntur Sutiyono, and he's going to bring this down to a country level with a focus on a key issue for many countries in our region, including Australia, which is the issue of just energy transitions. Over to you. Oh, actually, I'm just going to introduce Guntur first. So Guntur leads Climateworks Indonesian team, where he oversees projects working very closely with the Indonesian government on issues such as sustainable finance, fiscal policy, transport electrification, and of course, the energy transition. Prior to joining Climateworks, Guntur worked for the Climate Policy Initiative and the World Bank as an analyst in fiscal policy, public finance, climate finance, and environmental economics. Take it away, Guntur.
Thank you. Thank you, Meg. And good morning and afternoon, everyone. Are waiting for the slides? Yes. So most of the conversation in energy transition is focusing on how to retire coal power plants. But for developing countries and coal-producing countries, energy transition conversation expands its definition to include just transition. So I'm going to talk about the importance of including just transition into financing consideration this morning. The definition of just transition also developing. Previously, it only focuses on addressing the impacted workers. Now the concept expands as it involves environmental justice, climate and energy justice, not only focusing on livelihood, but also the distribution of health, environmental impact, indigenous people, women, vulnerable communities, and obviously local governments. So why does energy transition need to be just? Energy transition is deeply rooted in the social, culture, and economic structure of a region. And since there is an economic interaction and migration between provinces, energy transition will impact the neighboring region economically and socially. So there are several impacts we need to consider. Number one is the potential job loss. According to the World Bank, direct employment in coal in Indonesia is estimated to be around 240,000 people. So although the number doubles than what it was in 2009, it's actually still very small. It's about 0.04% of whole total formal employment. However, this has not included the indirect jobs and the other jobs in the whole supply chain, which will obviously need further analysis to know. Second, impact to local economy. In East Kalimantan, for example, one of the major coal-producing province, coal and lignite contribute to more than 1/3 of regional GDP, or gross domestic products. And within that province, fossil fuel-based economy, including oil and gas, contribute up to 80% of the districts or municipality gross domestic products. So a transition will probably most likely make these towns becoming ghost towns if not managed carefully. And third, the social and environmental impact in the regions, which will affect the poor and vulnerable communities. And this includes in the region where supposedly benefiting from the transition. So for example, the nickel producing regions. So clarification over what is the impact on solution to environmental damage, land use change, job loss, regional economy, population migration, and social protection programs is important to get public support. And this public support will affect the speed and success of the transition, as we also see in other countries. So just transition will need a policy package, especially in financing. To finance a just energy transition, Indonesia needs to connect dots between increasing incentives for renewable energy support, applying disincentives for dirty energy, and improving social protection programs. So incentives is given to the clean energy, for example, in form of tax benefits, government guarantees, regulatory certainty, clean energy-linked fiscal transfers, but also incentives to industries which transition to green energy. And to be honest, this is what is currently lacking in Indonesia. These incentives in Indonesia is already evident in the case of relocating fossil fuel subsidies to social protection program and in improving the social protection database. So we have done this many times. And despite the effect of increasing fuel price against the myth, our economy is doing just fine and our budget is healthier. So this incentivizing the fossil fuel is actually good for us. Other measures that government is working is taxing the emission through carbon tax or coal windfall tax. So this is still a lot work in progress. And then put that into social protection. And this can be in many ways. Social assistance such as direct cash transfer has been a working instrument in Indonesia and can be expanded or tailored to the transition affected households. Our social safety net, such as in state pension and universal healthcare, is another instrument which can be optimized. Now, the question is how much public money needed for this? And this is exactly part of financing that government need to discuss and be clear of. When we link that to our net zero target, we are way behind in financing it. So for example, Indonesia recorded an annual underinvestment of 13.4 billion annually to achieve its 2060 net zero goals, only from the power sector alone. So, how to move this agenda forward? There are a few examples of just transition in the world, and even more difficult to find one in developing countries. So the earliest we can do is to build understanding and break the misconception and all the myth around transition. So most people, at least in Indonesia, have limited knowledge of what is just transition. So we need more open discussions beyond electricity system and what it means for regions and for the communities. We need more evidence-based discussion and recommendations. We know that this topic can be highly political, but with the right influence, we already see changes. Second, we need a long-term vision planning. If we hear a couple of panel opinions talking about energy transition is not possible or that we could not move away from coal, it is mostly because these comments are using short-time vision. Obviously, there is no possible to retire everything, all coal power plants in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and then replacing them with entirely renewable. But this is exactly why long-term planning is needed. And for a long-term planning, we need a strong inter-ministry institutions arrangement, or arrangement. So another reason is just transition will require huge planning given the complexity of policies, which range I already mentioned previously in the previous slide. And finally, third, a clarification on responsibility distribution among government and non-government. This is because we want to avoid money wasting or putting burden on one side only. So it is imperative to make sure investment is best placed. So a while ago, Climateworks published a tool called the Investment Vision Guide. It lays out steps for government to steer a long-term vision investment design, which in this case could also be relevant. And finally, Indonesia belongs to an international community. It is a mistake to curb our ambition because we base it on the availability of our domestic financial resources. Energy transition is also an interest of our international partners, such as Australia, which is also undergoing a similar transition. So it will be very interesting to hear their regional perspective on this as well. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, Guntur. Really interesting insights on how Indonesia is approaching the energy transition, and in particular a just energy transition, which is a key challenge also for us here in Australia. And I just have to share a reflection. Guntur and I started working together about 4 years ago when he joined Climateworks. And at that point in time, this level of ambition and interest in energy transition in Indonesia was, I don't know, quite inconceivable. And yet this year, as the G20 chair, the Indonesian government is championing the clean energy transition. So anyone who needs some inspiration about, whether things can turn around quite significantly in a short period of time, I think Indonesia is a really fantastic case in point. Not that there isn't still a lot to be done, so I don't want to indicate that, but just the momentum is really, really shaping up. If you have just joined us, welcome to Climateworks Centre's briefing room, where we are talking about financing the region's clean energy transition. I'm Meg Argyriou, I'm the Head of International at Climateworks, and I've been joined already in today's session by our Energy System Lead, Dr. Emi Gui, and our Indonesia Country Lead, Guntur Sutiyono. And you are just about to hear from our Australia Country Lead, Anna Malos. Anna heads the Australia Country team, which provides Climateworks staff with context on Australia's political and economic landscape, which helps to have our work to have more impact. And prior to Climateworks, Anna was Assistant Director at the Climate Change Authority. She's also worked on climate policy, including as a Director of the Climate Action Network Australia. She's worked in the Victorian government, and she's also worked in the UK and Latin America. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Meg. So first off, I wanted to set out some figures about Australia's energy exports, as this context is fundamental to the role that Australia can play. So Australia's economy is very emissions intensive at present, and yet Australia has the resources to instead underpin a net zero global economy. So as you can see here, Australia is a major exporter of fossil fuels. We have about 20% share of the world's gas and thermal coal markets, and these exports mostly go to the region. And emissions from these exports far exceed our domestic ones. So our domestic ones are about a 1.4% share. That makes us the 15th most emitting country. But if you calculate the emissions from the use of our fossil fuel exports, it's about a 4% share of the global total. That's more like the 5th most emitting company. Now, these fuels are replaceable by renewable energy if investment in the transition is right. And Australia has those resources, solar, wind energy, and the space to harness them. Now, how this happens in Australia and across the region will be crucial to just transition that Guntur was just talking about. And that means that how the Australian economy is financed, our exports, the rules, incentives, and guidance on investment will have a material impact. That's kind of the things that Emi was talking about in a way. So Australia's trade and export policy, whether through trade agreements or domestic policy, will be crucial. At present, there are technical as well as financial and economic barriers to green energy exports replacing fossil fuels, both in Australia and in other countries. But there's also growing momentum. Planning and investment in commercial projects are already well underway. Just some examples. So we could Australia could export our clean energy through green hydrogen or ammonia. Now, exports of hydrogen from Australia are already being piloted, and trade discussions around green hydrogen and ammonia are underway with various countries in ASEAN and beyond, including Japan and South Korea. And an example project is the one being planned for Gibson Bay in Queensland. So the financial investment decision on this is targeted for next year. And the project is currently being supported in the development stage by Commonwealth funds through ARENA and also by the Queensland government. Emi mentioned the possibility of direct export of electricity. So this would be through undersea cables, and Sun Cable is an example. Now, this project aims to export electricity from solar farms in the Northern Territories to Singapore, currently targeting financial investment decision in 2024, with full operation before the end of the decade. And it would aim to provide 15% of Singapore's power needs. Now, Australia has many of the same challenges as elsewhere in the region, including the need to switch from fossil fuel dependent systems on. Now, I want now to go on to how else Australia can help. As a developed country, there is clear expectations on Australia. This includes sharing knowledge and directly supporting other countries to develop and also to reduce their emissions. And this means a complex web of interconnected agendas, programs, and policies, and it does mean financing. An important way that Australia should be financing this transition is directly through international development assistance and climate finance. Now, the initiatives and types of these two are similar, but there's a different focus for the outcomes. And I should note that climate finance is expected to be additional beyond development assistance. As part of this, Australia has programs to support transfer of knowledge and experience, because Australia is having to learn fast in its energy transition. And one of the key challenges is about how to make financing markets work. And many different ways are already being tried here by governments and the private sector to get the investment into the energy system at the pace needed and to incentivize the right things. And given that Australia is in the midst of rapid change, it can share knowledge and experience, because this isn't a one-way street. And here are just some of the parallels I can see between Australia and countries in the region, whether developed or developing. So Australian governments are experienced in operating state-owned assets, both within a privatised systems and directly where they control all the assets. So it is used to operating within a market. And this is not just about investing government money, but also how to attract private investment, how to make the different assets bankable, as Emi was discussing, and how to do so in mixed systems. And also Australia is learning from being a leader in off-grid systems and learning the challenges of high penetration of variable renewables like solar and wind. And funding, so, some of this is about technology transfer and knowledge transfer, but it's also about funding for relevant cooperative assistance programs, whether that's grants or concessional loans or, sending experts from Australia abroad. It's about supporting sustainable private finance. So Emi talked about, sustainable finance taxonomies so that investors know what's the right thing to be investing in. And it's about our export policy and financing. So how Australia's businesses are supported and, what they're supported to do, because this will be key to ensuring that Australia's energy exports switch from the current fossil fuel ones to green ones that can be used in the region. Australia has a new focus on climate change nationally, but unfortunately it's still promoting those things which are not supporting transition at the scale and pace needed. The whole world and Australia has to move far faster. The government is reviewing and developing a wide range of relevant policies, including a review of international development policy, and that will include climate finance. And I just wanted to end by discussing a couple of initiatives between Australia and countries in the region that are relevant. So one that was advanced recently was the Singapore-Australia Green Partnership. So the leaders of Australia and Singapore signed up to this very recently, and the plan is that at present, this partnership is laying down foundations for the kind of activities that do drive growth but reduce emissions. So this is about the flow of environmental goods, the green hydrogen I was talking about, green and transition finance, and ensuring the switch to clean energy. This is a new partnership, so it's very much under development, and it'll be interesting to see, how the countries progress this and how private sector can play a role. There's also the Indonesia-Australia Climate and Infrastructure Partnership. At the leaders' meeting in June, they discussed new opportunities to develop collaborations between the two countries, including access to affordable clean energy, so the just transition that Guntur was talking about, clean technology and sustainable finance. This includes, this includes a 200 million climate and infrastructure package with, again, the details still being developed. Now, Climateworks will aim to influence the role that Australia will play, and also how other countries sort of come to the table on these sorts of initiatives. And for Australia, that'll be through our domestic policies, but also our international role. Now, back to Meg so that we can discuss these issues further.
Thanks so much, Anna. So over the past half an hour, we have heard analysis from three of Climateworks' leading thinkers. Dr. Emi Gui identified some of the key challenges to the energy transition in Southeast Asia, and she also identified some specific strategies that can be used to overcome those challenges. We also heard from Guntur Sutiyono, who outlined why a just energy transition is important and what can be done to support such a transition in Indonesia. And you've just heard from Anna Malos, who gave us an overview of Australia's role. And so I'm going to move to audience questions in just a second. Please add yours into the Q&A so that we can make sure that our panelists respond and share their thinking. But before I do, I'm just going to ask a cheeky question myself. So we've just heard Anna, I'm going to throw this one to Emi as well. So Emi, we've just heard Anna talk about some of the high-level political agreements between Australia and countries in our region. We've heard about initiatives like Sun Cable, and some of the significant grants that the Australian government is giving to the region. But I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on what else can Australia offer to really help to catalyse the energy transition in the region?
I'll start in that case. Okay. Yeah, certainly. Australia definitely has one of the more advanced electricity market industry, I guess, both in terms of liberalization and transparency, compared to lots of Southeast Asian countries. Of course, in terms of technology deployment, Australia is also ahead of a learning curve compared to the Southeast Asian counterparts. So all these are a valuable experience and knowledge sharing opportunities with our neighbors. Particularly, we have one of the highest penetration of distributed energy in the world, with over 3 million households with solar rooftop PV and increasing, and utilization of demand-side resource, demand response. All this can be a valuable experience to share with our neighbors. So we have been doing quite a bit of capacity building in all these areas, including integrated energy and climate planning, electricity market design, and including sustainable finance. I think these are some of the advantage that Australia has, and certainly we have strength in.
Thanks, Emi. And I might throw the question to Guntur as well, just to get your perspectives. from the view of Indonesia, what else? And obviously the Australian government and Indonesian government have just recently signed a very, very substantial package of support for climate action in Indonesia. But what else, in your view, besides the money, what else would help Indonesia to really get going on the energy transition that Australia could provide?
Thanks, Meg. So I think two most important thing here with energy transition is, number one is actually clarifying a bunch of questions that we still need to answer through rigorous study and research. So, for example, the regional economic impact that will happen because of the coal phase down, or not just coal power plants shut down, but also the entire mining and its supply chain. That's number one. Number two is there's another, I'm sorry, including in the research, there's many other examples around what's the social impact of it, population migration, unemployment, potential conflicts. All of those things need to be addressed. So a whole bunch of research is really important into that, and that will feed into the design of policy for social protection program. And this comes to number two. For all of these things, social protection programs or just transition, this is beyond energy policy. Right? This is including it will involve other ministries, such as the Ministry of Social Affairs in Indonesia that deals with social protection program. This will involve Ministry of Finance that will think about how much we need to raise to help the affected households for this, and then where the money will come from. So all of these things. So we need an institutional support, an inter-ministry support. A very clear example in Indonesia at the moment is this National Agency for Accelerating Poverty Reduction that reports directly to Vice President's office. And this is very powerful in shaping a lot of or answering a lot of these questions, and that will feed into policy-making process, which in itself fall within the relevant ministries. But these ministries, they don't have the capacity to do all of these research that economics and social. So this agency acts as that buffer, but have the political power to mandate the ministries to use those recommendations and results. So I think those two things make that I could, at the very least from Indonesia case. Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you, Guntur. I'm going to throw a question to Anna Malos now. So Anna, how do you counter the argument that fossil fuel exports have no impact on climate change vis-a-vis Australia's emissions? It's obviously the burning of those products at the demand end that is the problem, but how do you counter that argument in a fossil fuel exporting economy such as Australia or Indonesia?
Yeah. So first off, it's only part of the problem. So, the extracting fossil fuels in Australia creates emissions. So that's from fugitives. So that's kind of, as you dig up the coal or you take out the gas, then some of it leaks. And it's also about processing those, the production itself. Because one of my kind of jaw drop moments was when I realized that Australia actually uses more of its gas to export its gas than either in the electricity sector or in any other section of industry. So, there are material emissions from digging up coal and extracting gas. But definitely it's more important the use of those, those resources. But then Australia has an incredibly high vested interest in changing the world's economy. We're very vulnerable to climate change, one of the most vulnerable developed countries. And, do I need to say it in a time when in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, once again, people are facing flooding that's been exacerbated by climate change. Now, so the thing is, we need to change our own exports. We need to change our economy so that we've got that our economy works for the future, and also that we help our trade partners, the people using those products, to use clean energy resources rather than the existing ones. So there's a whole range of ways that Australia can act in that space.
Thanks, Anna. I am going to throw a question to Guntur now as our resident sort of fiscal expert in this group. Guntur, can you give any examples of countries that have had success with their governments withdrawing fossil fuel subsidies, and how have they done that? I mean, obviously fossil fuel subsidies are a key barrier and constraint in terms of the energy transition. So I'm just wondering whether you have any examples that you could share on that.
Yes. Okay. So again, I'll take example of Indonesia. We are not 100% successful in removing all the fossil fuel subsidies, but there are examples where it was successful, particularly with vehicle fuels. And there are two main things key that are key to in the success of that. Number one, well, I mean, from the beginning, there's always and it's already evident that fossil fuel subsidies is always misallocated. It's always mistargeted. And Indonesia, even before we remove the fossil fuel subsidy, government always come up with that numbers, that studies, that research that shows how much it is misallocated and how much save that we could get from removing it. So from that, the narrative was already built. But the most important things are two, right? Number one is government have a clear plan on what it is going to be used for. So in terms of reallocating the fossil fuel subsidy into the poor and most impacted households. And this is done through, like I mentioned before, cash transfer programs or social protection programs. A couple of examples, for example, unconditional cash transfers that is directed to poor households for 3 months or 6 months and can be extended. And then there is a conditional cash transfers, which is given to houses or households with school age children, for example. Number two, I think what people underestimate is the importance of the database. And this is a huge work in Indonesia. Even until now, we keep improving our lower income household database to avoid mistargeting, because this is very easy for developing countries to mistarget. And when mistargeting happens, public support diminish, and it's becoming very difficult to move forward with fossil fuel removal subsidy. So these are the two. And again, the cash transfer is not new. It's not Indonesia invention. It's something happened already anywhere else. It's just about, number one, making it clear what kind of programs that you want to, that the country is putting or reallocating the subsidy to. Again, universal health care is also one of the beneficiary of this removal. And then, yeah, it is very, very worthy for developing countries to invest in improving the lower income household database. And that's what works in Indonesia.
Thanks, Guntur. That's really interesting in terms of just kind of redirecting funding from one thing, which is the fossil fuel subsidies, to another area that's going to be affected by it, as a really key mechanism for the transition. I'm going to throw a question to Emi now. Emi, what would you say that there's a funding availability issue for the energy transition versus support for adaptation, so loss and damage, for example? What did you hear in the discussions that you were having with stakeholders from across ASEAN? Was there sort of a sense of there being a focus on one or the other of those issues as a greater priority for funding?
Yeah, I think we're kind of talking about two different things here. So for the energy transition funding is most related to mitigation, while loss and damage mainly focusing on the adaptation. Yeah, I guess from my point of view, yeah, after a few rounds of quantitative easing around the world's central banks, I don't think the quantity funding is the key here. It's really lack of bank project. I think it's also related to the overall ecosystem and eco-environment to improve the project bankability. Of course, I talked in my presentation a number of mitigation strategies, but since energy transition is such a massive and unprecedented problem challenge. So that strong alignments in all elements would help, I guess, in that sense. Strong alignments in policy, regulation, planning, appropriate level of market mechanism, incentives, a level playing field for both incumbent and private sectors, effective planning and system processes, and also attend to what really the customer wants and customer behavior and their acceptance to certain technologies and the policies. All these matters to bring on accelerate the deployment of clean energy technologies and projects. So yeah, I guess other panelists might have a different view, but yeah, from my view, it's not a funding problem. It's really the environment, a conducive environment to enable the funding flow into the clean energy and energy efficiency projects is the massive challenge right now.
Thank you, Emi. As always happens, we're getting lots of questions coming in at the last minute, and we're not going to have time for all of them, but I am going to end with one final question to Anna. And yeah, if you can keep your response reasonably succinct so that we can get everybody out of this session on time. Hydrogen.
Yeah.
Hydrogen, of course, is touted as the replacement to gas exports. But given the time frame to commercialization of hydrogen and the challenges with exporting hydrogen via shipping, is this a form of greenwashing?
So I think, there's some very big unknowns about hydrogen. We don't yet have commercial scale production of green hydrogen. We've got pilots of exports, but they're still pilots. So can it be done at the scale and cost necessary? Still a very big unknown. I wouldn't say it's greenwashing. It's more kind of, I'd say, technology optimism. And so, the issue really is technology optimism getting in the way of reducing other forms of emissions? So, I'm a big advocate that we should reduce all forms of emissions as quickly as we possibly can. We certainly shouldn't be waiting for hydrogen to be the big solution. I'd say one other thing, though, is that, obviously hydrogen can be used in all sorts of ways, but there's only some that it makes sense. It's going to remain pretty expensive, and also it's inefficient to produce hydrogen and then use hydrogen. So where possible, you want to electrify things. So, within Australian homes, we don't want gas boilers heating our hot water that are run by hydrogen. We want to use, heat pumps and other forms. So hydrogen, great potential, but is being over touted in some areas.
Thank you so much, Anna. That brings us to the end of our discussion today. So thank you to our amazing panel, Anna Malos, Dr. Emi Gui, and Guntur Sutiyono. And a huge, huge thank you to the Climateworks communication team as well for their effort in putting on this event. They do all the amazing work, not only in making this an incredibly smooth run thing on the day, but also in preparing all of us so that we look very polished on the day. So a huge shout out to them. You can find out more about our work and catch up on previous briefing rooms at climateworkscentre.org. And as I mentioned in the intro, next up for us, some of us, in fact, Emi and I are heading to COP27, where we're putting on 2 events at the Australian Pavilion at COP27. So do come along and hear us talk. And we also will be speaking at other events in different places. And I think maybe we'll share that via the newsletter in coming days. Stay tuned to all of our channels for more on this and all of our activities this November. Thank you.